Greeting and warm welcome to you all to this brief presentation on critical theory and post-structuralism, Habermas and Foucault. This presentation is based on the essay written by Beatrice Hanssen, and this presentation has been prepared as part of assignment of critical theory and discourse studies course of MPhil second semester at Nepal Open University. My name is Pushpa Paudel. I am a student of MPhil second semester at Nepal Open University, and I am thankful to my course facilitators, Professor Ramchandra Paudel, PhD, Professor Ved Prasad Giri, PhD, Mr. Prakash Paudel, MPhil, for their insights and then encouragement to excel in this course. Let me discuss about the content of today's presentation. The contents of this presentation include critical theory, the Frankfurt School, post-structuralism, Habermas and his major contributions, Foucault and his major contributions, comparative discussion Habermas and Foucault, summary, references. Critical theory. While talking about critical theory, we remember the Frankfurt School of Theorists, which was established in 1923 as an autonomous section of the University of Frankfurt. Its first director, Karl Grunberg, saw it as a center for historical and sociological inquiry inspired by Marxist theory. Within a few years, leading members of the institute, including Herkimer, Adorno, Benjamin and Marcuse, were giving equal emphasis to purely theoretical work incorporating elements of psychoanalysis and existentialism into a new form of Marxism known as critical theory. After 1923, the Nazis forced its closure and the institute was moved to the United States, where it found hospitality at Columbia University in New York City. It moved back to Frankfurt in 1949, where Habermas emerged as its leading figure. It is concerned with the issues and involves in critique of modernity and capitalist society. The definition of social emancipation as well as the detection of pathologies of society. Some of the most prominent figures of the first generation of critical theorists were Max Herkimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, Friedrich Pollock, Leo Lowenthal, and Erich Fromm. Since the 1970s, a second generation began with Jürgen Habermas. With Habermas, the Frankfurt School also turned global, influencing methodological approaches in other European and academic contexts and disciplines. The third generation of critical theory scholars include different people from Frankfurt or other independent scholars and mostly of American scholars who were influenced by Habermas' philosophy during his visit to the United States. Klaus Hoff, Joseph Fruchtel, Hawk Brunhorst, Klaus Gunther, Axel Honneth were to name a few. Similarly, in 1930, Max Horkheimer succeeded to Grunberg. It was under Horkheimer's leadership that members of the institute were able to address a wide variety of economic, social, political, and aesthetic topics, ranging from empirical analysis to philosophical theorization. Horkheimer published the ideological manifesto of the school in his Traditional and Critical Theory, which was published in 1937. This was an essay where he addressed some of the previously introduced topics concerning the practical and critical tone of theory. In 1938, Adorno joined the institute. He was invited by Horkheimer to join the Princeton Radio Research Project. Dialectic of Enlightenment is their joint work. It means Adorno and Horkheimer, they jointly published Dialectics of Enlightenment. Horkheimer and Adorno emphasized the role of knowledge and technology as a means of exploitation of labor, and viewed the dialectic of reason as the archetypical movement of human self-liberation. So this is what they have mentioned in their Dialectic of Enlightenment. Similarly, in 1956, Habermas joined the institute as Adorno's assistant. He published The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere in 1962. After his nomination in 1971 as a director of the Max Planck Institute for Research, Habermas left Frankfurt. He returned to Frankfurt in 1981 after having completed the theory of communicative action. Action. So, before I discuss post-structuralism, in order to understand it better, I want to discuss structuralism first. Structuralism designates a group of primarily French thinkers who, in the 1950s and 60s, influenced by Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of language, applied concepts from structural linguistics to the study of social and cultural phenomena. Structuralism was developed first in anthropology by Claude Lévi-Strauss, then in literary and cultural studies by Roman Jakobson, Roland Barthes, Gerard Genet. They introduced this in literary and cultural studies. Similarly, in psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan introduced this. In intellectual history, Michel Foucault did this. And in Marxist theory, Louis Althusser used this. These thinkers didn't form any school of thought as such. It was under the label structuralism that their work was imported and read in England and in the United States of America and elsewhere in the late 1960s and 1970s. After this background of structuralism, I hope it's easier to describe post-structuralism. Once structuralism came to be defined as a movement or a school, theorists distanced themselves from it. It became clear that works of the given structuralist did not fit the that idea of structuralism as an attempt to master and codify structures. Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, and Foucault, for example, were identified as post-structuralist. They attempted to describe how texts create meaning by violating any conventions that structural analysis locates. They recognized the impossibility of describing a complete or coherent signifying system, since systems are always changing. Post-structuralism emerged in France in the late 1960s. The two figures most closely associated with this emergence are Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida. Barthes' work around this time began to shift in character and move from a structuralist phase to post-structuralist phase. Barthes' work, The Structural Analysis of Narrative 1966-67 and The Pleasure of the Text 1973. He published these two books. The structural analysis of narrative is close to structuralism, whereas The Pleasure of the Text, which he published in 1973, this is an example of the text written in post-structuralist views, let's say. So then he also published The Death of the Author in 1968. Then this book by Barthes announced the death of the author, which is a rhetorical way of asserting the independence of the literary text. Barthes says in the essay, the death of the author is the birth of the readers, because each text read by a new reader becomes new, because the reader introduces or makes analysis of that text from his or her own perspective. So there will be multiple perspectives of the text once the author creates a text, and then it when he or she makes public, then different readers, when they go through, they form their own perspectives. It does not mean that the writer's perspective is to be understood by all. Then the second key figure in the development of post-structuralism in the late 1960s is the philosopher Jacques Derrida. Indeed, the starting point of post-structuralism may be taken as his 1966 lecture, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of Human Science. Speech and phenomena discourse of speech and phenomena of grammatology and writing and difference confirmed Derrida's rise to prominence. Some key characteristics of post-structuralism I want to discuss here. Some of the features of post-structuralism. The critique of the sign, the absence of transcendental signified, the absence of central structure and author, idea of multiple meanings. Once the text is read by multiple readers, they form their own meanings. Focus on the readers. Then text offering larger space of interpretation means multiple interpretation will be there. Varied nature of interpretations will be there of a text. Similarly, support for multiculturalism, feminism, pluralism. So multiple views are there, and when a writer or author includes, he or she also includes all these points. Truth is not final. There is no truth, no hierarchies, and no binary oppositions. This is what the post-structuralist they opine. And then the subject is decentered. Reader replaces the author in textual analysis because author's interpretation won't be the final one. Interpretation is dependent on the reader's personal concept or self. Then the key figures of post-structuralism include Gilles Deleuze, Julia Kristeva, Umberto Eco, Ja Baudrillard, Judith Butler, etc. Then let me shed some light on Jürgen Habermas. He was born on 18 June 1929. He was born with a cleft palate, underwent surgery twice, and this made him interested in communication theory. This is what he himself said, and I found somewhere else. He was a German philosopher, political scientist, and sociologist. He was highly influenced by Karl Marx, Hegel, George Lukács in the University of Bonn, where he received his PhD too. Earned doctorate in philosophy from Bonn University. He studied philosophy and sociology at Goethe University of Frankfurt under Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. He served as an assistant to Professor Adorno when he joined Frankfurt School. At that time, he was the assistant of Professor Adorno. Then later on, he got an opportunity to be the director of Max Planck Institute. He remained there for about more than a decade, let's say, and then his major works include so many works he authors, and some of them are the structural transformation of public sphere 1962 towards a rational society 1967, a legitimation crisis 1973, knowledge and human interest 1968, communication and evolution of society 1979, the theory of communicative action 1981, moral consciousness and communicative action 83, philosophical discourse of modernity 1985, which the essayist Beatrice Hanssen talks about modernity, philosophical discourse of modernity, and then Habermas and modernity 1985, between facts and norms 1992, and many others he has written. Yes, Habermas of course is an influential figure, and later on we will compare the works of Michel Foucault and Habermas. And now let's know Michel Foucault better. In 1926 he was born in France. He was a son of a surgeon, born to an upper middle class family, educated at Lycée Henry IV and at École Normale Supérieure elite institutes. These schools are elite schools, only elite had access to this school. Hegel, Marx and Althusser remained influential to Foucault, and it is said that in 1948 Foucault attempted suicide for being homosexual and then finding homosexuality in the marginalized status in society. Of course, he was French philosopher, social and intellectual historian, and cultural critic associated with the structuralist and post-structuralist movement, let's say. He had a strong influence on philosophy and in a wide range of humanistic and social scientific disciplines. Foucault's theories primarily address relationship between power and knowledge, and he has strong influence on communication studies, sociology, cultural studies, literary theory, feminism, and critical theory. Some of his major works include The History of Madness, The Birth of the Clinic, and The Order of Things, and The Archaeology of Knowledge, Discipline and Punish, The History of Sexuality 1976, and he completed other 2 volumes shortly before his death from AIDS related complications in 1984. He was died of AIDS related complications. The questions and issues he raised have permanently reshaped the humanities and social science. So he has given very important inputs to social sciences and humanities. His ideas, his insights, his views, his philosophy really is incomparable. Foucault's work relentlessly challenges what counts as common sense knowledge about human nature, history, and the world, as well as the social and political implications of such knowledge. Of course, to understand Foucault, generally we have to understand discourse, subjectivity, knowledge, power, etc. These are the key understanding of to understand Foucault. And the archaeology of knowledge is the name Foucault gave to his method of intellectual inquiry. For Foucault, discourse establishes and controls knowledge, he says. And then during 1970s, Foucault devoted his research to what he described as the genealogy of power, and discussed how discourse and technologies of power are employed to discipline human behavior. So he is interested in talking about the power, discourse, truth, and then power determines truth, power determines and discourse determines truth, he says. And then the group or the people who are in power, they decide the discourse, and then and the truth will be shaped or formed on the basis of the power. So power has a role to play in every discourse, and power also creates, let's say, truth. The term genealogy refers to a mode of historical analysis that Foucault developed in text. Foucault sees that history as narrative, but as a narrative that is fragmented, non-linear, discontinuous, and without absolute certainty of cause and effect. For Foucault, history is textual and conveys a narrative that is ambiguous and conflicting. Historicity of the text and textuality in history, what he says, it means history should be read from a new perspective. In every reading, the history should be watched from new perspective. That is what Foucault opines, because history is not always truth, because history is said by power. This is what he says. Foucault, following Nietzsche, he finds truth as error. Truth is undoubtedly the sort of error that cannot be refuted because it was hardened into an unalterable form in the long walking process of history. Foucault was most interested then in understanding historical documents as discourses of knowledge that highlight some perspectives while suppressing others. Foucault wanted to reread the past and narrate the story from other perspective. This point I already discussed. So he wants the history or the past should be reread, and then the history or the story of the past should be narrated again and from other perspectives also. How it was written in the past, the same perspective may not be always true. So it should be reread from new perspective, and this is what Foucault opines. Then Foucault sought to interpret the past in ways that highlight the ambiguity, fragmentation, and struggle that necessarily accompany any historical analysis. Foucault in a nutshell. To talk about Foucault in short, Foucault's the theme that underlies Foucault's work is the relationship between power and knowledge, and how power is used to control and define knowledge. So how it is used to control and define knowledge. Power, what authorities claim as scientific knowledge, are really just means of social control. Through this they control this society. Foucault shows how, for instance, in the 18th century, madness was used to categorize and stigmatize not just the mentally ill, but the poor, the sick, the homeless, and indeed anyone whose expressions of individuality were unwelcome. Foucault raises the voice of the voiceless and advocates for making the powerless powerful. This is what I found on internet, written by Philip Stokes. Then discussion on Habermas and Foucault, and then we will have a kind of comparative discussion on Habermas and Foucault too. There is a contentious debate between second generation critical theorist and post-structuralist since the publication of Modernity and Unfinished Project 1980 and the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity 1985. Similarly, rejection of universalism by the post-structuralism together with the defunct narratives of rationality, legitimacy and normative justification. So post-structuralists, they refute or say they deny universalism, and this is what Habermas talks about: universalistic principle in every institution, in every field, in every philosophy. This is what he views. And then but post-structuralists, they do not see any possibility of forming universalism or uniformity in doing things in philosophy, in science, in education, and this is not possible. This is their position, post-structuralist position. The works of Habermas and Foucault highlight an essential tension in thinking about political and administrative rationality. Political administrative rationality. It means the works of Habermas, very rightly. This is the tension between consensus and conflict. It means Foucault sees conflict, whereas Habermas says consensus, and ideals and reality. With the point of departure in Kant, Habermas is the philosopher of morality based on consensus. Foucault, following Nietzsche, is the philosopher of real history, told in terms of conflict and power. What he says, his theory is related to conflict, power, and how power determines knowledge, this kind of thing. And this brief presentation is also all about the comparative analysis of central ideas of Habermas and Foucault. We will ask whether solutions to problems of political and administrative rationality are best understood in terms of consensus and ideal theory, or whether conflict and real history work better as a frame of reference. To answer these questions, we need to understand the ideas behind the discourse ethics of Habermas and the power analytics and ethics of Foucault. Contrasting the two and evaluating their merit for people interested in understanding political and administrative rationality and its role in social change, let's say. According to Habermas, the modern age is inaugurated with Kant. He shows the importance of Kant's attempt to develop a universal rational foundation for democratic institutions. Habermas agrees with Kant as to the need to develop such a foundation for democracy and its institutions, but he points out that Kant failed to achieve his goal. According to Habermas, this was because Kant's thinking was based upon a subject-centered rationality. Habermas points out that to the later philosophers from Hegel to Marx to contemporary thinkers have also been unable to develop the much sought after rational and universal foundation for such social and political institutions. Most contemporary thinkers believe that it is not possible to establish a universal constitution of philosophy, social science, social organization, but Habermas thinks that his own work can provide this constitution and that the consequences of abandoning it are unacceptable. He thinks that without a universally constituted philosophy, science and democracy, the result would be contextualism, relativism and nihilism, all of which Habermas sees as dangerous. Habermas' ideas contradict with Kant and contemporary thinkers on how aspect of constituting rational society. Habermas is universalistic, top-down moralist, is concerned process. The rules for correct process are normatively given in advance in the form of the requirement for ideal speech situation. What is right and true in a given communicative process is determined solely by the participants in that process. For Habermas, human beings are defined as homo democraticus, means democratic beings. For the formation of universalization principle of discourse ethics, everyone should participate in a particular communication or discussion freely. So they must get chance to utilize their freedom, neutralizing their position and power. So they can discourse, they can put forward their views freely. So he highlights some 5 processual requirements of discourse ethics, and then he says that no party affected by what is being discussed should be excluded from the discourse generality. If some discussion has no meaning to any party of the discussion, then that should be excluded. All participants should have equal possibility to present and criticize validity claims in the process of discourse autonomy. So they should have equal possibility to criticize or to put forward their views. And then participants must be willing and able to empathize with each other's validity claims. They should take their roles actively. Then existing power difference between participants must be neutralized. For example, in a particular piece of communication, there is a negotiation, there is discussion, there is communication between a minister and a common man, and then these two interlocutors' position should be neutralized. They are equal in that particular case of communication. Let's say course, they are equal. And then participants must openly explain their goals and intentions. Also they must openly explain their goals and intention also. These are the procedures that Habermas outlines in communicative rationality. So Habermas is seen more optimistic and uncritical about modernity than Horkheimer and Adorno. He says constitutions, rules, laws governments, these kind of devices, they can unite citizens and can regulate power in a pluralistic society. So Habermas describes to us the utopia of communicative rationality, and he mentions lack of crucial institutions, crucial socializations, poverty, abuse and degradation as barriers to discursive decision making. And then he talks no or very little about the relation of power that create these barriers. Yes, these lines are from Modernity and Unfinished project that he wrote in 1980. As the philosophical descendants of Nietzsche, post-structuralist thinkers were said to embrace an anti-democratic, anti-enlightenment irrationalism as aesthetic anarchists committed to a history of radical discontinuity rather than to continuity with modernity. These so-called young conservatives, this means he has pointed towards post-structuralist, abandoned the postmodernist, abandoned the Western tradition of reason in favor of a reductive theory that devalued all power to the level of force or violence. And from this, he is in an opinion to give continuity to modernity. Once there is modernity, then nothing is there postmodern. So just by adding the prefix post, things do not get changed. This is what he opines. And then let's discuss about Foucault. For Foucault, both Foucault and Habermas are political thinkers. Foucault says to search for a form of morality acceptable by everyone in the sense that everyone would have to submit to it seems catastrophic to me. This is what he says. So Foucault is a Nietzschean democrat for whom any form of government, pluralistic or totalitarian, must be subjected to analysis and critique based on a will not to be dominated, voicing concerns in public and withholding consent about anything that appears to be unacceptable. Foucault's norms are based on historical and personal context, and they are shared with grounding independent of those, and they are shared with many people around the world. The norms cannot be given a universal grounding independent of those people and that context. For Foucault, nothing is fundamental. Universal must be questioned. Nothing is universal. Nothing is foundational, fundamental. For Foucault, our history endows us with the possibility to become aware of those social arrangements which create problems, oppressive political and administrative systems, for instance, and those which create satisfaction, strong democracy, for instance. It follows that we have the possibility to either oppose or promote these arrangements. For Foucault, the socially and historically conditioned context and not fictive universals constitutes the most effective basis for action. According to Foucault, Habermas' authorization of power by law is inadequate. The juridical system is utterly incongruous with the new methods of power, says Foucault. Methods that are employed on all levels and in forms that go beyond the state and its apparatus. Our historical gradient carries us further and further away from a reign of law. The law, institutions or administrative procedures provide no guarantees of freedom, equality or democracy. Not even entire institutional systems, according to Foucault, can ensure freedom even where they are established with that purpose. To take An example of this is the very recent case of corruption by one of the commissioner of CIAA. So people who are in position, who are in the institutions that are there to provide provide or ensure democracy, to ensure freedom, to ensure equality to people, and the people who hold position in those institutions, they themselves violate these norms. They go against the rules and regulations. So these kind of examples are very vibrant, are very massive. So we cannot say that just by forming constitutions, just by establishing institutions, freedom, power, justice, and these things cannot be guaranteed to the people. Similarly, Habermas is in an opinion to establish democratic institutions, whereas Foucault focuses more on how existing constitutions and their associated institutions can be utilized more democratically. For Foucault, freedom is a practical, and its ideal is not a utopian. Absence of power, resistance, struggle, and conflict, in contrast to consensus, are the most solid basis for the practice of freedom. Similarly, Foucault focuses on conflict and power relations as the most effective point of departure for the fight against domination. It means people who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who are suppressed, even they themselves have to struggle, they have to be united, and this is what Foucault opines. Then finally, I have come to the summary of today's presentation. Foucault and Habermas agree that rationalization and the misuse of power are among the most important problems of our time. They disagree as to how one can best understand and act in problem. Habermas' approach is oriented toward universals, context independence, and control via constitution writing and institutional development. Foucault focuses his efforts on the local and context dependent and toward the analysis of strategies and tactics as basis of power struggle. The value of Foucault's approach is his emphasis on the dynamics of power. Understanding how power works is the first prerequisite for action, because action is the exercise of power. His focus is on real rationality, which is contextual and context is specific. From the perspective of the history of philosophy and political theory, the difference between Foucault and Habermas lies in the fact that Foucault works within a particularistic and contextualistic traditions that focuses on conflict. Foucault is one of the more important 20th century exponents of this tradition. Habermas is a prominent exponent of a universalistic and theorizing tradition that focuses on consensus and derives via Kant from Plato. In power terms, we can compare Foucault and Habermas in this way: strategic versus constitution. Foucault's strategies, constitution related to Habermas, struggle versus control, and conflict versus consensus. The latter ones for Habermas and the first ones for Foucault. So I have come to the end of today's presentation. These were some of the works that I consulted during the course of preparation of this presentation. So I am highly indebted to these authors. Finally, thank you all of you for listening to me patiently for such a long time. Thank you very much.